Hello and welcome, everybody. So, my name is Stephen Fortuna, and this is the show where we bring together some HR experts to break down some of the most fundamental topics in the HR world. Our topic today is HR effectiveness. That's the effectiveness of your HR department. And I have joining me several amazing panelists. I'll go ahead and introduce them now. So, we have with us Brandon Butters, who's the HR manager technology at Vivint. We have Emily Kay, who is an HR director at Orange Recycling Services. And last but not least, we have Lotus Buckner, who is VP of People and Culture at Chowbus and founder and CEO of LB Talent Solutions. So go ahead and say hi, all of our panelists. So glad to have you. And we're going to jump right in. So I want to just start off with kind of a baseline, just kind of gut reaction to this question. Just to kind of set the stage. So what is kind of your definition of an effective HR department? What does that really look like? And I'd love, Emily, if you could kick us off in this conversation. And Brandon, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well.
So for me, it's both big and small. And I am a department of one person. So for me, it looks a lot like the strategic plan, spending time thinking through those things and where the company is and how the company is moving, to also the everyday touch points, the Instacart orders for a sick employee's family, just those little things that I think so often get missed, but really sort of sew together the relationship between employee and employer. And so for me, it's both big and small.
I love that. Brandon, what would you add to that conversation?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Emily uncovered a lot of things that I would use to define an effective HR department. My group is a little bit bigger, so keeping that in mind, right, and that our audience is a group of professionals all across industries and different groups. I'd say an effective HR department is really one that has a seat at the table, right? And I think you gauge that more than anything else. Are you invited? Are you included into staff meetings and things along those lines where you can give input and have opportunities to provide your opinions or your strategy or the things that you can help the business accomplish that they're really setting out to try and go out and either do or get done for the overall product line or whatever group you support overall. So for me, to add to what Emily has already added, I would say that. Do you have a seat at the table as an HR representative, and you feel that you can add opinions or ask questions or things like that to your business partners?
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful answer, Brandon, and Emily as well. Just kind of, the strategy and the tactics, and do them in a way that gives you a seat at the table, so that you can have even bigger influence. Emily and Brandon, you both kind of highlighted that you work at different sizes of organizations, and that's one of the things that I want to kind of talk about a little bit with you. Lotus, tell me a little bit about how being an effective HR department might be different or isn't different at different sizes of organizations, like they highlighted. Do you think they're different at all, or is it kind of the same thing?
I do. I think that there's actually some really major differences, but I also think that there's similarities. So depending on the size of your company or organization, I mean, there's so many factors that play into that, right? Different industries look a little bit different as well. But when you're part of a smaller company or a startup, HR can definitely look different because you're wearing multiple hats. Whereas in a larger company, you might have a lot of different specialists, there's more resources available, and everyone kind of has their primary responsibilities that they really focus on every single day. But to me, to be effective in a really small HR organization, you really need to be able to do multiple things well, which can be really hard because HR is very vast, right? You're also responsible sometimes in these smaller companies for things that you don't typically think of as HR, or that a bigger company might have a separate department for. So think of things like internal communications, executive coaching, event management. You don't have, you wear all of those hats. So I think that there definitely is a huge difference depending on the size. But I think in the end, I really like what Brandon said. If you're invited to the table, whether you're in a small company or a big company, you know you're adding value and you know that you're being effective. And so I think that from that perspective, that's going to be true no matter what size company you're with.
Perfect. I love that. Um, let's talk kind of zoomed out a little bit about the bigger role that HR plays in businesses. And what I really want to get to in this sort of topic is the why. Why should anyone think about making an HR department effective or investing in an effective HR department? You know, some people will look at different departments in a business and say, this is kind of just something we need, but we don't really need to invest in it to grow our business and make it better. And Brandon, I'd love to have you start this off, and then have everyone weigh in eventually. But you talked a little bit about an effective HR department gets a seat at the table. Why should HR have a seat at the table and be something that businesses invest in at all?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. It comes up often, right? And when people are talking about different costs, it's like, is this a department we actually need? And I would argue that HR, obviously biased a little bit, is definitely one of the most important departments to have within your organization. And the reason for that is because HR offers unique people perspective that oftentimes individuals don't consider. You know, you're thinking about even at a smaller organization, right? How do your people navigate their own development? How do you grow them? How do you engage them? Well, I've sat in a lot of meetings where the company will have a really great idea of where we're going to run to, but they forget that you actually have to have a team of runners to run to that location. Yeah. And being involved in HR, you are fundamentally poised to look at what does the company actually have from a resource standpoint in your labor, your people, right? And can they actually accomplish those tasks given maybe the technology that you have, given the actual bandwidth of your people? And I think HR is really good at helping the business understand that some initiatives aren't going to be accomplished in the timeline that they're looking for because you're a little bit more aware of what the people are looking for or what's out there. And then another piece of that is, can you afford it, right? From a compensation standpoint, I know one of the hats that I wear is that compensation analysis piece, being able to tell the business if they can afford to go find someone that has that skill set, or can we make do with the talent that we have today? I think that's a critical piece is, are we staffed appropriately? Do we have the talent in-house? If we don't have the talent in-house, can we go get the talent? And what is that going to cost the organization overall? And is this initiative that is really in the long run going to add value and keep our people here and keep our people pleased? And then the last thing I always add is that HR always comes with a very unique perspective around inclusion. I don't think the business is always good at thinking about the initiatives that they're doing in a fundamental way as far as it relates to, is this inclusive enough of the people that we already have in our organization?
Awesome. I think that's great. Emily and Lotus, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. So why should companies invest in making an effective HR department? Why do they need it?
I mean, Brandon had some great points, and I love how he puts things together, like very digestible little nuggets. But I think that bottom line, if you aren't able to leverage your human capital to motivate them to get the job done, you can't move the business forward. And I work in a pretty high risk industry. So for us, a lot of my value comes in risk management, and kind of working to make sure that people are safe and healthy and working their jobs appropriately so that they aren't getting injured and, being out of work. And then we're back to the drawing board. And so I think that for my niche, that isn't a really important part of what I do to keep people, keep the HR function effective. But I mean, I agree with all he said. It's you gotta be looking at what can you afford, how can you motivate people to do the jobs in front of them.
Perfect.
Stephen, I'd like to just add another perspective here. I think I agree with all of what Emily and Brandon said. I think from when you think about a CEO and a CFO and what they're thinking about, it's often not the people, unfortunately, right? Like they have money on their mind. And I think there's a business case there as well. Like, absolutely, we need to be taking care of our people and making sure that experience is really good. But there's also a business case that investing in an effective HR organization is going to save you money. Like
Yeah.
there is a bottom line impact there, and it's not just all the fluffy feel good stuff. Having a compliant employment practices, having meaningful employee experiences, having a highly impactful employee life cycle can lead to things like lower turnover and higher retention, lower cost to hire, less lawsuits, like Emily said, less penalties, and all of those things are going to save a company money. So I think that's always been a way that I've seen like HR departments really get their seat at the table when they don't always have the buy-in from the beginning from their executive team.
Yeah. Well, you three have made a really strong case. I think it's pretty obvious that an effective HR department and function is an important part of businesses, like you said, for the money of it, and also just making sure people are taken care of, and so many other reasons. So I love that. Let's move into a little bit of the how, and start to give our listeners a little bit more concrete ways that they can start thinking about their effectiveness as a department and ways that they can improve. So the way that I want to start with this is, how do you actually measure HR effectiveness? We kind of talked a little bit in the beginning, maybe hinted at some things, but what are some concrete metrics that you think HR departments should be tracking and reporting on that are kind of measures of those effectiveness? And Lotus, I'd actually love you to start this one off, and then we can have Emily chime in as well, if that's possible.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of traditional metrics that we look at, right? Turnover, retention, time to fill, time to hire, employee experience scores. And I think all of those things are really important. But there's two things that I always like to remind HR professionals about. One, compare those metrics to how your revenue and your business metrics are doing, right? Be that true business partner. So don't just measure HR metrics in a silo. Really trend them against how the business is doing, so you can really show that as you improve your people programs, your business is also improving. And then the second piece of that is, I think it's always important to also track all of those metrics with demographic data layered into it, so that you actually know where you have disparate impact and need to make adjustments in your practices. Because, for example, it might look really great if your turnover is 12%, but if you dive a little bit deeper at that 12%, you might find that the vast majority of employees that are actually leaving and who make up that 12% are people of color, employees of color. And that's a really huge problem.
Yeah, that's great. Emily, what metrics are important to you in measuring your effectiveness?
I think for me, risk is where I spend a lot of time. It seems to be sort of, when you work in a reactive industry like I do, that risk kind of seems to be taking over what you're looking at. But for me, a lot of times I'm comparing, and I have a lot of really good data that I've kept on sort of, our frequency and injuries. Where are people getting injured? How are they getting injured? And then backing that up against like training. What are we bringing in? How are we training our employees? How are we teaching them? And are we teaching them in a way that they can learn and understand? And that's a huge thing for me, because I have a lot of super unique and different pipelines that I hire from. And so for me, I want to make sure that they are actually understanding the information that I'm teaching them. So there's several ways you can do that. And one, we track volume statistics from our all of our recycling materials that we collect. And so I have sort of a quick and dirty way to know if they're understanding what I'm teaching them by, are they tracking their paperwork correctly? Can they fill this out correctly? And sort of that gives me like a really quick glimpse of how they're learning. And then, the injuries and that sort of thing. I spend a lot of time. I feel like it's on my brain right now because I was just on the phone with them dealing with it. But I think it's a huge impact on organizations, especially smaller ones, that people kind of gloss over and say, well, we have workers' comp insurance that covers that. But what you don't realize is every dollar they spend, you are spending that in premium somewhere. And so kind of chasing down that trail is really important.
Yeah. I love that we can kind of dive into some niches here.
Yeah.
And Brandon, I know that you're kind of in the tech space with Vivint. Do your kind of effectiveness metrics look different? What is important to you kind of at your role?
Not too much from your standard metrics, right? Like we talk about time to fill and we talk about attrition rates and, our employee engagement survey. What do those scores look like? And how do we in tandem utilize those to measure the initiatives that HR is actually going out and getting done? One thing that I'll say about, I think, metrics overall is that for people who are starting out, or maybe you're new to the area or the field, or you're a one man or one woman stop and show, all those different components and pieces, remember not to get too caught up in your metrics at first. Look at them as a starting point. Pick something that you're going to identify. Don't try and build Rome in a day, because it can be really easy to get overwhelmed by your metrics and go, and not really understand. One thing that I'll say with attrition that I think oftentimes some HR professionals get is that your goal is not zero attrition. It's actually good to have some healthy turnover in your organization, because that opens up and allows people to move through the organization. What you really want to understand is when people are leaving, first off, why are they leaving? And I think another piece is how long are they staying before they leave? Looking at your attrition data in a little bit more of a nuanced capacity. Lotus talked a little bit more about digging in deeper to understand your demographics that are departing. And I think there are other components of attrition. So even within your metric, understand that there are sub-metrics that drive those numbers that you really want to understand before you go out and start to make action plans or things along those lines, so that you actually are getting at the kind of the crux of the issue really at hand. Is why are people leaving? It's not that they're leaving that's necessarily a concern, but why are they leaving? What's the tenure of the employee? What's the demographic of the employee? That way you know where you need to go and what policies or practice you need to influence as an HR professional.
Absolutely. I want to actually double click on a metric that you brought up, which is employee engagement. Just because I've heard that one talked a lot about recently, and it's kind of one of those all the metrics maybe could flow into it. Maybe, who knows, right? It's one of those top metrics. Lotus, I'd love to hear your thoughts on employee engagement and the importance of that, maybe, or how you would go about measuring that, or if there are some other metrics too that are kind of those top ones to be looking at.
Yeah, I think the thing with there's like a net promoter score, right? That's pretty common. And it's a good metric to look at regardless of size or industry. But outside of that, I think that we sometimes lump employee engagement into this big bucket, and it really, to make it effective, to make your action plans effective, and to really understand the story behind your results of your survey, you have to be really intentional about how you build that survey. Taking just out of the box surveys isn't always going to get you the information and the data that you actually need, because every company is different, right? Like, you're dealing with different gaps. And so really understanding that and doing a deep dive root cause analysis to really understand what it is that you want to survey is going to be really important. So as an example, I talked earlier about turnover and diversity. If you know that that is something that you need to work on because you've looked at your data and you've done that root cause analysis, your survey might want to be focused on a lot of inclusion, belonging, and diversity questions, so that you can really measure that and fill that gap. If you're just, if that's really your problem, but you're surveying are people happy and do you feel like you have good career paths here, you're not going to get to solving the real issues that you're trying to solve. So I think my advice is really customizing your approach to employee engagement surveys. And I actually like the word experience better than engagement, because really I think engagement is so subjective. And for employees, there are employees who they come here because they their goal really is they enjoy their job just fine, but they're not there to overly engage with the company. They have a family at home. That's their priority. They do really good work, and they kind of shut down and they get their paycheck and they can support their family. And that's where they want to spend their energy, and their engagement is with their family. And so it's really about creating the experience, because experience is different for every single person. And we just live in a world now that's not one size fits all. So I think really customizing our approaches are really important.
Emily, I see you nodding over there. Do you have any comments you'd throw in that
No,
concept?
I agree with that, and, like, getting sort of creative in how you gather that data, because again, my employees, like, would not fill out a survey emailed to them, whereas, like, maybe a different organization, that's an effective way to collect data. So you do have to get really creative and kind of know what your organization needs. And I just think it goes all back to, like, having your finger on the pulse, being in the seat in the table. Like, you got to kind of know what's going on. And I think, it's a lot of HR departments operate sort of on their own island. And so it gets harder to gather that data when you're not, you know, have your finger on the pulse. But I definitely agree with all of that. But you got to get creative on what they need.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love the theme that's kind of emerging around just really understanding your business, understanding the metrics that are important as related to kind of the bottom line of the business, and then doing what you can to, I mean, like you said, Brandon, some metrics need to go up, some to go down, and some turnover, it's good to keep it consistent, right? Or whatever. So just really understanding your business is going to be key here, it sounds like. I want to move to kind of another section of this because like there's an actual performance aspect where it's like, is the HR department effective? But then there's also kind of a communication piece where there's probably a lot of effective HR departments out there that don't have a seat at the table and don't have any line to somebody in higher up to really show that they are effective and advocate for themselves. So I'd love for us to kind of have a conversation around that. Let's say, your business, as an HR department, you have your metrics and you're working really hard and you're seeing everything moving in the right directions. What's the best way to like get that seat at the table and start communicating how effective you're actually being? I think, Emily, if you could start this conversation off, and then Brandon, if there's something you want to chime in, or Lotus, either one, you guys are welcome to.
I think for me, it's like rooted in relationships. So you don't just get a seat. Generally, you don't just get a seat at the table right away. You kind of have to build those relationships. And for me, came into an organization and created this position that did not previously exist in a like 30-year-old business. And so for me, it was those relationships in the beginning were so vitally important. But then I think my goal at that point was like, all right, I'm onto something, but I got to figure out how to communicate this to you in a way that you understand. So just knowing how leadership thinks and sort of observing how they absorb information, which for me, with a background in social work, like I like doing that anyways. But I just sort of, okay, he's a numbers guy. So let me explain this to him from the numbers standpoint. Let me find the holes. Let me see where the numbers are and add them up. And so really just getting those relationships and sort of getting to know people genuinely helped me so much in the beginning. And I think can serve people a long way. And sort of just, there are small conversations here and there, they weren't nothing big and crazy in the beginning. And then you sort of start slowly rolling out your ideas. And then just some like casual conversations, but mentioning things helped me too. Just like bringing up something randomly in a conversation, but I knew they would like stop and think about it. And then, that gave me sort of some I don't know, a baseline to follow up on. So that's sort of, but you got to know how your leadership thinks and you got to have relationships. I think those are the two main things.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. Emily, I think, calls out some good things. And I would add two things to that. And the first that Lotus actually called out early on is being able to talk about to your impact in terms of dollars. Mm-hmm. Right? Business individuals in your organization love hearing, show me the money, right? Like if you can show them your effectiveness in terms of the return on investment, or this is how much we've saved, or this is what you can do to avoid a loss of money, or different things along those lines, you're always going to win a lot of brownie points with the leadership in that regard. And it helps earn that spot at the table. when you can actually show in terms of money, this is what we're saving. And whether that's, let's say you've really been focusing on, time to fill, you're cutting out a whole bunch of additional time or things along those lines, you've reduced that amount, then you're saving money along that. If it's an attrition standpoint as well, right? People walking out the door, that is a sunk cost. And you need to be able to identify how the reduction of that number saved the company money. I think Emily also spoke about, risk management. So reducing injuries in the workplace by having good risk practice policies or whatever it may be, that those are all things that you can show in terms of value in dollars. And then the other thing that I would just support that Emily indicated before is that relationship building piece is going to be so critical for anybody in the organization. I can't stress that enough, that walking the park, being with the people, having conversations, making yourself known, and kind of peeling back the layers of HR being this scary individual that people invite, or the principal's office. People have made that comment to me. Oh, I feel like when I come to your office, it's the principal's office. Mm-hmm. So I try to get out of my office. I go to people, I go to where they're at, because HR's office does sometimes feel that way. In a lot of ways, is that, oh, why am I going to HR's office to have a conversation? So going and meeting people where they're at, I think, is really critical on helping getting that seat at the table, as also talking in terms of, dollars and how your initiatives and policies that are effective are saving the company money.
Love it. Do any of you have any, in addition, I love the idea of just this organic relationship building, being a people person and understanding, do they want the numbers? What's the dollar value that they want to see? Do you guys have, in addition to that, sort of scheduled reporting or any kind of more scheduled and kind of facilitated interactions like that? And I'd love for you guys to just talk about a few of those that you found that are effective.
I can jump in there. At a bigger organization like Vivint, we do what are called OKR readouts. People are familiar with that, right? Like objective, keys, results. It's goals, really, when it boils down to the goals that the company set out to achieve. HR is involved in those departments. I'm involved in setting HR's OKRs with the business in tandem with my leader. And we talk about, this is what the business wants to accomplish. How can HR support those initiatives? And so what are our goals to help support? So one of the things, for example, is to reduce attrition and improve succession planning within the technology group. And the way in which we're doing that is by providing more developed career development paths and trajectories for people, basically creating a player card, right, for each of our people within the organization. And these really robust succession planning charts that allow individuals to understand where all the skills are at in the organization, so that we can effectively give opportunities. We're not spending so much time trying to go outsource external talent when we have internal talent that can fill the job that maybe we weren't aware of. And those are ways in which we report on regularly. We report on those OKRs typically every couple of weeks on what's the progress, how are we trending, what does this look like, and read out in that way. And that's something that we do often. And then for my leaders and a lot of their staff meetings and things like that, we talk often about, what does attrition look like? I meet with the finance partners that I partner with and talk about, what is our attrition numbers and is that healthy? What's our labor budget look like? And send a number of reports to individuals to help them understand ultimately where we're at. And that can just be an effective summary. We send a recruiting summary, for example. How many open roles? How many have been filled? What do we have left? What does our candidate pipeline look like? And you creating those opportunities to just send simple, easy, digestible summaries of what HR is working on is also a way to get your effectiveness out there for people to see and digest and consume relatively quickly.
I think it's awesome. Lots of great concrete examples there, Brandon. I really appreciate that. Do either Lotus or Emily, do you have any other kind of reports or messages or meetings that you have found to be effective in communicating what HR is doing?
So,
Lotus, I see. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that I think is really important, I love sharing the OKRs because we do that too. That's pretty common in kind of startup spaces as well. But one of the things that I found adds so much value is it takes a little bit of vulnerability. And so you kind of have to feel out your senior leadership team. But one of the things that I introduced at my company is HR annual reports. So we built out annual reports like you normally would for a board and present it to the board and to the leadership. But I was like, why don't we share this with our employees? So we actually share ours now with the entire company. Anyone at any level can look at it, and it talks about the mistakes we made in the previous year. So it's not just about what did we accomplish, but it talks about the mistakes that we've made, the metrics that we fell through on. So there's a lot of vulnerability to share that with the entire company, but I think it builds trust. And so back to Emily was talking about relationship building earlier. That's one way to do it, is you really have to build trust. And if you're really transparent about what you're doing and how you're doing, that's a good way to start building that relationship.
Great.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Emily. Yeah.
Well, I love that. And so we just had a major move from one of our facilities kind of rather quickly, and condensed into like one warehouse and another building. Anyways, and the overwhelming feedback through the entire move from our employees where they were so glad to all be in one place again, because we'd been kind of spread out in downtown Durham, and we have like multiple buildings and you kind of have to drive between them. And so I love that. It's kind of getting my brain turning of like, oh, maybe that was sort of them telling me like, we want to have like everyone involved in this. And, I agree, times that we've let employees into like all team meetings versus management meetings, we really have gotten that buy-in from all levels. And they kind of feel like they're included and more like a family, in some ways. So I think that's really cool, and great for smaller organizations to do right away.
Yeah. What I really love about it is that kind of radical transparency and communication, both the mistakes and just the successes as well. It serves the purpose of communicating to other people the value that you're bringing, but also keeps you accountable and makes you thinking, on whatever cadence that is. Oh, how could we make this annual report better next year? Because you want to make sure that report looks good, right? And so I think there's definitely a lot of benefits to doing stuff like that. Those were all great examples. I have just one final question for the whole group here. And this, just to kind of boil down your advice, what would you say to an HR department, probably a smaller one? What one piece of advice would you give to them that they could do today to start improving the effectiveness of their HR function? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this. Why don't we just move in alphabetical order here, actually? So Brandon, you want to start us off, and then we'll go to Emily and then Lotus?
Yeah, sure. One thing, right, that you could do. I think for me, as I think about it, oftentimes in smaller groups, is I think my time in smaller groups and smaller HR pieces, there isn't a lot of metrics. So I would sit down if you're, one-man show, one-woman show, maybe got a couple people in your group, really identify what do you want to measure as a group, right? What metrics would you like to see present, and start small, right? Maybe you want to measure attrition or your time to fill, or even measuring kind of your seat at the table. How often are you attending meetings? How often are you involved in business making decisions? And then from there, create your plan of action. What are you going to do to either create those metrics? And then what are you going to do with the metrics when you get them? I think that would probably be where I would start in an organization where maybe it's not as robust or as large, where you have quick access to that kind of data. Just really start to consider, what do you want to measure? How do you want to measure it? And then what do you want to do with it when you have it?
Great. Emily, you want to?
Yeah, I think for me, what's like popping into my mind and kind of goes in tandem with that is, go spend some time with your employees, with the employees of the organization, managers. In the beginning, gosh, I spent so much time just having lunch with them or talking to them in on their break in the warehouse or wherever it was, just kind of spending that time building those relationships. And that's how I gathered information that gave me what I needed to build sort of those more technical needs analysis, and what was just kind of figuring out what's going on and seeing what they were doing, what worked, what didn't work, what changes could be made. And I think that really helped me, and it feels like something you could like go walk out the door and do right now.
Yeah.
All right, I'll try to wrap that up in a bow, the way Emily and Brandon said that, because, for me, especially at a small company, I think you have to go in and do a root cause analysis. One of the mistakes that I see HR leaders make often in small companies is they go in and they start implementing because they want that value to be shown. But I actually think that's a mistake. If you don't do your root cause analysis, you don't look at the data that you already have and figure out what data you don't have, and you don't know the difference between that, like Brandon talked about, and you're not out there getting a pulse of the company, the employees, the senior leaders, like Emily said, you're not going to understand what the gaps actually are, and you could very well be implementing and solutioning something that doesn't need to be solutioned. So do your homework and give yourself time to do that root cause analysis before you start trying to add value, because I know that's just a default for a lot of people is you want to go into a new company and you want to show that you can really make changes and do things. But if you don't do the due diligence, you could really be hurting yourself.
Amazing. Thank you, Lotus. That was a good bow that you tied there in the end. So appreciate that. That was our last question, everybody. Thank you to everyone who's watching. If you want to learn more about HR effectiveness, go ahead and check out, we have an encyclopedia article written about it. And please connect with each of these panelists. You can find their profiles on our members pages for HR Mavericks. And really, we talked about a lot of different terms here, different metrics and things. Stop by the HR encyclopedia that we have. We have articles on most of those if you want to learn more. So thank you so much. Thank you three. This has been amazing. I've learned a lot. We hope you have an amazing rest of your day.
Thanks, Steven.
Thanks.
Thank you.